The Daedra are often called demons, but that only captures part of what they are. They can be hostile, destructive, and lethal to mortals, yet they are not a single evil faction with one shared goal. In Elder Scrolls lore, they exist outside the normal order of mortal history, which makes them harder to judge in simple moral terms. Some Daedra are cruel, some are playful in ways that still end in death, some obey strict rules and bargains that mortals barely understand. Others seem indifferent until someone offers tribute or makes a deal. The real issue is not just that they can be dangerous, it is that their motives and loyalties do not fit human ideas of good and evil. That is the darker truth behind them. The Daedra are not just monsters lurking beyond the world. They are a reminder that the Elder Scrolls universe follows rules that are older, stranger, and far less human than the ones mortals live by. To understand what the Daedra really are, it helps to separate the term from the insult. In everyday speech across Tamriel, Daedra is often used as shorthand for anything monstrous that comes out of Oblivion, but the lore draws a much sharper line than that. Daedra are not mortal races, and they are not dead souls wearing a new shape. They are powerful beings native to Oblivion, existing by rules that do not depend on the mortal world. That is a major reason they are so hard to define. They do not belong to the same order of existence as Nords, Bretons, Dunmer, or any other mortal people. That separation matters because the Elder Scrolls setting also distinguishes Daedra from Aedra. The Aedra are bound up with the creation and structure of the mortal plane, while the Daedra did not give themselves up in the same way. In broad terms, the Aedra are associated with the world mortals live in, while the Daedra remain rooted in Oblivion. That is why the two groups are often treated as opposites, even though the reality is more complicated than a simple divine versus demonic split. Both are vast, both stand beyond ordinary mortals, and both can shape history in ways people barely understand. The difference is not just morality. It is origin, place, and nature. That is where the common assumption starts to break down. If someone in Tamriel calls a Daedra a demon, they are usually speaking from fear, not precision. Some Daedra are hostile, and some are extremely dangerous. But the category includes far more than battlefield enemies or cult targets. Daedra can be powerful princes, lesser servants, strange spirits, or entities that mortals mistake for personalities alone. They are not all pursuing the same goal, and they are not all interested in conquest. What they share is not a single agenda, but a shared existence outside the mortal order. That is why the Daedric princes matter so much. They are the most visible and influential Daedra in the lore, and they shape how mortals think about the whole group. When people talk about Daedra, they are usually thinking of beings like Molag Bal, Mehrunes Dagon, Boethia, Sheogorath, or Azura. These princes are not simple monsters. They are vast intelligences tied to specific spheres of influence, and those spheres shape how they act. One prince may embody domination, another change, another deception, another madness, another dusk and dawn. That already says something important. Their actions are not random bursts of evil. They are expressions of what they are. That does not make them safe. It makes them alien. A mortal can choose kindness or cruelty, mercy or violence, because mortals are judged against ethics. Daedra do not start from that same place. They may understand mortal morality well enough to exploit it, imitate it, or ignore it, but they are not bound to it in the way a person is. To a Daedra, a promise, a test, a ritual, or a bargain may matter more than compassion. That difference is a big part of why they seem so alarming from the outside. People look for familiar motives and find something colder, stranger, and often far more literal. There is also an important consequence to this distinction. Because Daedra are not mortal souls, they do not fit neatly into the normal cycle of life, death, and afterlife that applies to most people in Tamriel. That is one reason they are treated as enduring presences rather than passing individuals. A mortal ruler dies and leaves a legacy. A Daedric prince can remain, reshape its sphere, recover from conflict, and continue influencing events over vast stretches of time. Even lesser Daedra can return in ways that make them feel less like creatures with a lifespan and more like recurring forces. That is also why mortal cultures have built so many different traditions around them, from worship to prohibition to practical bargaining. Some groups fear them, some revere them, and some use them whenever they think they can be controlled. So the first truth is simple. The Daedra are not just demons in the ordinary fantasy sense. Tamriel fears the Daedra because people keep meeting them through loss, not theory. The reputation did not come from a single sermon or a stray rumor. It grew out of repeated contact with powers that enter mortal life as cults, curses, bargains, possessions, and disasters. Most people hear Daedra and think first of the princes: Azura, Boethia, Clavicus Vile, Hircine, Molag Bal, Meruns Dagon, Sheogorath, and the rest are the names mortals actually encounter, directly or through followers and artifacts. These beings are not distant in the way some gods are imagined to be. They act, they interfere, they reward followers, punish enemies, and force their plans into the world. Even when a prince is not driven by simple hatred, those plans are rarely built around mortal safety. That is what people remember on the ground. A village does not need Daedric theology to know something is wrong when a cult starts gathering in the woods, when neighbors vanish after a ritual, or when an ordinary object brings ruin to everyone who touches it. Mortals usually meet Daedra through the aftermath. By the time anyone asks what power was behind it, the damage is already done. Fear becomes common sense. Large-scale history reinforces the same lesson. Daedric interference keeps showing up in invasions, corruption, and upheaval across Tamriel. Sometimes that means a direct breach from Oblivion. Sometimes it means an artifact that warps everyone who uses it. Sometimes it means a mortal who thought they could bargain with a prince and stay in control. The form changes, but the outcome is familiar. People suffer first, explanations come later. That pattern gives the Daedra a reputation built on visible consequences. Daedra are usually treated as distant creators or sacred patrons, but Daedra are remembered as active intrusions. Their influence is easier to point to because it leaves scars in communities, in temple records, and in family memory. A burned farm, a vanished child, a town emptied by fear, a ruler undone by an artifact. Those are not abstract warnings. They become local history. Even when a prince's action helps one follower in the short term, the wider cost is often paid by everyone nearby. That is why Daedra in everyday speech often means more than a category of supernatural beings. It becomes almost a synonym for danger. Most townsfolk are not drawing careful lines between every spirit, lesser Daedra and prince. They are reacting to a pattern that has repeated often enough to shape culture. Temples warn against Daedric worship. Laws often treat it as a serious threat. Stories passed down over time focus on the worst outcomes because those are the ones people remember. The family that lost someone to a cult never forgets the name. The village that escaped an attack still talks about it years later. The fear lasts for another reason too. Daedra rarely offer help in a way that feels stable or human. Even when they give something useful, it usually comes with a condition, a debt, or a hidden cost. A favor can turn into a trap. A blessing can become a burden. Protection may only last so long as the mortal obeys some demand that makes little sense to anyone else. That kind of relationship is hard to trust because it never feels equal. It feels like standing on ground that can give way at any time. Once a mortal accepts that kind of deal, the consequences tend to spread beyond the original bargain. A single pact can pull in family members, neighbors, an entire town, or even a political order. Some Daedric schemes exploit ambition, others feed on fear, grief, or weakness. Either way, the people involved are rarely left unchanged. Even a successful interaction can leave a person isolated from their community, tied to a prince's favor, or marked by a reputation they cannot shake. That makes Daedric contact feel less like religion and more like contamination. From a mortal perspective, that is the core of the problem. The Daedra do not need to care about mortal order, morality, or survival to be powerful. Their goals may involve domination, temptation, challenge, chaos, hunger, or change. If those goals happen to match a mortal's needs, the result can look helpful for a while. If they do not, the mortal becomes collateral damage. That is why the line between benefit and ruin is so thin. So the reason the Daedra seem evil is not superstition alone. To understand the difference, the main thing to keep in mind is that the Daedra do not operate by mortal ideas of right and wrong. In Elder Scrolls lore, each one is defined by a sphere, and that sphere is not just a personality trait. It is the shape of what that Daedra is. One prince may stand for change, another for domination, another for hidden knowledge, destruction, lust, or deception. So a Daedra is often acting from the core of its own nature, not making a moral choice in the way a mortal would. That is why their behavior can look so inconsistent from a human point of view. Mortals expect power to come with restraint, or at least with some shared standard of conduct. The Daedra do not have to think that way. If a prince is tied to ambition, lies, or conquest, then manipulation is not a lapse. It is part of the pattern. If a prince rules over fear, corruption, or forbidden knowledge, then the harm that follows is often not an accident. It is what happens when that nature is expressed without concern for the people caught in it. This is where a lot of mortal misunderstanding comes from. People in Tamriel often call the Daedra evil because the results are so destructive, but destruction alone does not fully explain them. Their actions are usually deliberate and consistent, but consistent according to their own logic. A prince who rewards those who follow a certain path is not being kind in a mortal sense. A prince who punishes disloyalty is not suddenly being fair by Daedric standards. They are enforcing a system that was never meant to protect mortal life. That difference matters because it changes how their worst acts should be read. When a Daedric force invades, corrupts, or tempts, it is not always choosing evil the way a person chooses cruelty. Sometimes it is closer to a storm or a fire, except with intelligence and intent behind it. That does not make it harmless, it makes it harder to reduce to simple labels. A flame is not moral, but it can still burn a city. The Daedra often work the same way, not random, not sentimental, and not bound to the ethical expectations mortals place on their gods. Even their bargains reflect this. A Daedra may offer knowledge, strength, safety, or revenge, but the cost is usually built into the bargain from the start. The catch is not always a hidden trick. Sometimes it is simply that the Daedra values something a mortal should never have agreed to give up. In that sense, the Daedra are often brutally honest about what they are. They may not lie less than mortals, but they are rarely pretending to share mortal values. The problem is that people keep trying to treat them as if they do. That is what makes the missing context so important. Once you stop assuming the Daedra are fallen versions of benevolent gods, their behavior becomes easier to understand, even if it does not become easier to trust. They are not a single race of simple villains. They are powerful beings whose identities are inseparable from their domains, and those domains often overlap with mortal suffering in ways that are almost unavoidable. What looks like wickedness is often a force following its own nature all the way through. It also helps to remember that Tamriel's history is full of cases where Daedric involvement was not a matter of open attack. Sometimes a prince works through cults, artifact worship, or subtle promises that pull mortals into situations they think they can control. A scholar can be drawn in by knowledge. A soldier can be drawn in by power. A desperate person can be drawn in by relief. By the time the cost is clear, the mortal is already inside a system designed to favor the Daedra from the beginning. And that leaves the harder question. Daedric princes are dangerous because their gifts are real. A mortal can ask for help, get an answer, and still come away ruined by the terms. That is the core of their relationship with mortals, not random cruelty, but bargains shaped by each prince's sphere of influence. They do not aid people like allies would. They offer what they are, and what they are is always tied to a specific kind of power. Clavicus Vile makes that easy to see. He is linked to wishes, deals, and temptation, so he rarely needs to force anyone into disaster. He can let the mortal volunteer for it. People come to him wanting a shortcut, and he gives them one in a way that usually creates consequences they never considered. That does not make him chaotic in any meaningful sense. It makes him predictable in a very bad way. He turns desire into leverage. The mortal may get what they asked for, but they often lose more than they expected when the fine print catches up. In stories and legends alike, that pattern repeats because it is built into his nature. A wish granted by Clavicus Vile is never just a favor. It is a transaction in which the prize and the price are often separated only by the mortal's own optimism. Hermaeus Mora works differently, but the pattern does not change. His sphere covers knowledge, memory, and secrets, which makes him one of the most useful and most dangerous Daedric princes at the same time. In a world where lost lore, hidden spells, and buried histories can change everything, knowledge has real value. Mora can reveal it, preserve it, or keep it locked away, depending on what serves him. That can make him seem wise from a mortal point of view. It can also make him manipulative, because the information he gives is rarely neutral. It changes the person who receives it, and it often carries a cost that only becomes clear afterward. Knowledge can create power, but it can also create obsession, dependence, and isolation. Mora understands that better than anyone. His bargains do not always look like traps at first, because they often begin with something genuine and useful. The problem is that he controls the context around that truth, and context is often what decides whether a mortal is enlightened or undone. Sanguine shows a softer-looking version of the same problem. He is associated with pleasure, indulgence, and revelry, so he can seem less threatening than princes tied to violence or ruin. But his bargains still work on the same principle. He offers release, escape, and temptation. A mortal who accepts that offer may get exactly what they wanted in the moment while ignoring everything that follows. The danger is not always that the gift is fake. Often the gift is real. The danger is that Daedra do not measure outcomes by mortal standards. They are not asking whether the result is healthy, honorable, or wise. They are giving what fits their nature. That is why even Sanguine, who can seem playful compared with the more openly hostile princes, still fits the same pattern of mortal vulnerability. He does not need to push people into excess. He only needs to make excess feel like relief. The harsher princes make the same truth harder to ignore. Malakath is often connected to outcasts, suffering, and endurance, which means some followers see him less as a destroyer and more as a protector of the rejected. Mehrunes Dagon, on the other hand, is tied to destruction and upheaval, and he is far easier to read as an enemy because his sphere so clearly threatens mortal order. But even here, the difference is one of expression, not morality. One prince may shelter the broken, another may tear down what stands in the way. Neither is acting from human ethics. They are acting from divine instincts that mortals can sometimes benefit from, but never truly govern. Malakath's support for the rejected can feel loyal, but it is still shaped by hardship and survival. Dagon's disasters can advance rebellion or change, but they do not become righteous just because they clear old structures away. In both cases, the prince remains an outside force whose priorities do not naturally match mortal life. That is why Daedric deals are so unnerving. The prince does not need to lie in order to hurt you. The help can be genuine. The protection can be real. The knowledge can be worth having. None of that makes the prince a moral ally. They do not give because they care in the human sense. They give because the exchange serves their influence, their sphere, or their larger purpose. A mortal who understands that may survive the pact, or even profit from it. A mortal who does not usually learns the hard way that the reward was never free. In many cases, the real damage only becomes clear after the bargain has already narrowed the mortal's choices. By then, the prince has already gotten what it wanted, another proof that mortals will trade certainty for desire. So the dark truth behind the Daedra is not that they only destroy. That is the part of Daedra lore that gets overlooked, and it is the part that matters most. Strip away the titles, shrines, and horror stories, and the Daedra are not just devils waiting to corrupt mortals. They are beings whose motives are bound to their nature so tightly that ordinary ideas of good and evil stop fitting very well. The important difference is that Daedra do not live by the same moral framework as people. They are not meant to build families, govern kingdoms, or measure their lives by duty and mercy. They are beings of oblivion, shaped by their own spheres and impulses. One prince may stand for domination, another for knowledge, another for change, another for destruction, and another for lies or excess. Those spheres are not disguises. They are what the Daedra are. That is why judging them like mortals leads to bad conclusions. A Daedric prince does not wake up and choose a moral code the way a person might. It acts according to its own pattern, and that pattern can be helpful, destructive, or both at once. This is also why the same Daedric power can appear as a savior in one story and a disaster in another. A prince of healing or protection can still demand obedience, sacrifice, or devotion. A prince of knowledge can give real answers and still ruin the life of anyone who asks the wrong question. A prince of change can open doors no mortal force could open, but those doors may lead somewhere no one can control. From the outside, that can look inconsistent. In Daedric terms, it is not inconsistency at all. It is self-interest expressed through divine power. That distinction matters because it explains why Daedra are often more direct than the gods their enemies serve. Direct does not mean kind, it means clear. A Daedric prince is usually honest about what it wants, even when the deal is ugly. Mortals may still underestimate the cost, but the terms are often there. The danger is that the promise is real enough to tempt you. A blessing can be real. A warning can be real. A gift of power can be real. The catch is that every gift from a Daedric prince strengthens the prince as much as it helps the mortal receiving it. That pattern repeats throughout Tamriel's history. A desperate ruler asks for help against an enemy and gets a victory that comes with a curse. A scholar reaches for forbidden insight and learns something valuable only to be ruined by the consequences. A follower believes they are being chosen for favor when they are really being used as a symbol, a vessel, or a test. The result can still look miraculous. A kingdom might be saved, a plague might be lifted. A secret might be uncovered. But the source of that miracle is never neutral. It always pulls the mortal world a little deeper into the prince's sphere. That is a very different kind of threat from a mindless enemy. It is closer to a contract with a power that never stops acting in its own interest. Some princes punish betrayal, some reward devotion, some toy with followers, some preserve entire cults for reasons only they understand. But the pattern stays the same. Mortals matter to them, but not as equals. Mortals are tools, pieces, experiments, symbols, or investments. Sometimes they are protected, sometimes they are consumed, sometimes both happen in the same bargain. Even Daedric worship reflects that imbalance. Mortals do not usually approach a prince because they want evil for its own sake. They go because they want an answer, a cure, revenge, success, escape, or power that no ordinary path can provide. That is what makes Daedric influence so persistent. It feeds on need. The more impossible a mortal problem becomes, the more tempting a prince looks, because the offer does not have to be fair to be attractive. In a harsh world, that is enough to create cults, bargains, and disasters again and again. And that is the real reason the Daedra have such a terrible reputation. Not because every act they commit is random cruelty, and not because every one of them is equally malicious, but because no mortal can safely stand inside their system and expect human rules to apply. The danger is structural. They are stronger, stranger, and less morally constrained than ordinary beings in Tamriel. When they help for reasons that are not yours. When they punish, they do so with the weight of a power that does not need permission. So, the dark truth is not that the Daedra are simple evil hiding behind a complicated image. It is that they are more complicated than that, and still dangerous for exactly that reason. They can be allies in one context, tormentors in another, and sources of knowledge or power all the while. That is the real shape of the Daedric truth. The fear around them is not just superstition or old horror stories. The Daedra are dangerous because they do not share mortal limits, ethics, or priorities. But the deeper mistake is treating them as one evil force. They are separate powers, each with a different nature, sphere, and way of dealing with the world. That is what keeps their lore compelling. The Daedra are terrifying, but they are not simple. They can offer knowledge, protection, temptation, or ruin, sometimes all at once. The final truth is plain. They are feared for good reason, but they matter most as alien powers with their own agendas, not a generic evil faction hiding in the dark.